Blood pooled beneath her motionless body as gunfire echoed through the Afghan mountains. Sarah Mitchell, a 28-year-old intelligence analyst, lay crumpled behind a concrete barrier, her breath coming in short, painful gasps. 3 bullets had found their mark during the surprise Taliban attack on Forward Operating Base Chapman. Her left shoulder was shattered, her leg bleeding heavily, and consciousness flickered like a dying flame. But what happened next would shock everyone who thought they knew Sarah Mitchell. When Navy SEAL medic Jake Rodriguez crawled through the chaos to reach her, expecting to treat another civilian contractor, he had no idea he was about to discover a secret that would change both their lives forever. As his trained hands began assessing her wounds, something didn't add up. Her breathing pattern, the way she instinctively positioned herself for cover, how she automatically checked her 6 even while injured. These weren't the responses of an ordinary intelligence analyst. "Ma'am, I need you to stay with me," Jake whispered, applying pressure to her wounds. "What's your background?" Sarah's eyes met his, clear despite the pain. In that moment, a truth emerged that would reveal why a simple analyst was really stationed at one of Afghanistan's most dangerous outposts. Her response would explain why she moved like a ghost through enemy territory, why insurgents had specifically targeted her, and why her personnel file contained more redacted information than a classified CIA operation. This is the true story of 2 warriors who found each other in the darkest moment of war, where survival meant trusting someone with secrets that could destroy everything they'd built. It's about discovering that sometimes the person lying wounded beside you might be the most dangerous operative you'll ever meet, and the only one who can save your life. The bullets were still flying, but Jake Rodriguez was about to learn that rescuing Sarah Mitchell was just the beginning of a mission neither of them saw coming. Sarah Mitchell had been invisible for so long that she almost believed it herself. For 8 months, she had walked through Forward Operating Base Chapman in Afghanistan wearing the unremarkable uniform of an intelligence analyst. Her cover was perfect, a quiet woman from Ohio who processed satellite imagery and wrote reports that nobody seemed to read. She ate her meals alone, kept her head down, and spoke only when spoken to. Everyone saw exactly what they expected to see: another civilian contractor counting down the days until her rotation ended. But invisibility was Sarah's greatest weapon. She had learned to be invisible long before Afghanistan. Growing up in a small town outside Cleveland, Sarah had been the daughter nobody noticed. Her father worked double shifts at the steel plant while her mother disappeared into bottles of wine and romance novels. Sarah became an expert at moving through her own house without making a sound, at being present but unnoticed, at watching everything while revealing nothing about herself. That skill served her well when she was recruited by the CIA at age 24. The recruitment had happened at Ohio State University, where Sarah was finishing her master's degree in international relations. She had been sitting alone in the library, as usual, when a woman in a plain gray suit sat down across from her. "Sarah Mitchell?" the woman had asked. "My name is Rebecca Collins. I represent an organization that values people who can see without being seen." The conversation that followed changed Sarah's life completely. Rebecca explained that the CIA needed operatives who could blend into any environment, who could gather intelligence without raising suspicion, who could kill if necessary, but preferred to remain undetected. Sarah's psychological profile, her academic records, and, most importantly, her natural ability to become invisible made her an ideal candidate for deep cover operations. The training had been brutal. 3 years at a facility that didn't officially exist, where Sarah learned 15 different ways to kill a person with her bare hands, how to speak 4 languages without an accent, how to hack computer systems, how to disappear completely, and how to lie so convincingly that she sometimes forgot the truth herself. She learned that her real name might not even be Sarah Mitchell anymore, that her past was now a carefully constructed fiction, and that her future belonged entirely to her country. Her first assignment had been infiltrating a terrorist cell in Syria. Posing as a journalist, Sarah had spent 18 months gathering intelligence that led to the capture of 3 high-value targets and prevented 2 major attacks on European soil. Her second mission took her to Somalia, where she spent a year as a humanitarian aid worker while actually tracking down weapons dealers. She had been shot twice, stabbed once, and nearly drowned, but her cover had never been blown. Afghanistan was supposed to be different. After 6 years of deep cover work, Sarah had been promised a desk job. The intelligence analyst position at FOB Chapman was meant to be her transition back to a normal life, whatever that meant anymore. She would process real intelligence from a secure location, help coordinate operations from behind a computer screen, and slowly remember what it felt like to be Sarah Mitchell instead of whatever identity she had been wearing. But Afghanistan had other plans. FOB Chapman sat in the Khost province, just 15 miles from the Pakistan border. It was one of the most dangerous outposts in the country, constantly under threat from Taliban forces, al-Qaeda operatives, and local insurgents who moved freely across the border. The base was home to 300 American soldiers, contractors, and intelligence personnel, all of whom understood that every day might be their last. Sarah's cover story was simple and boring, exactly how she preferred it. She had supposedly worked for a private intelligence firm in Washington, D.C. before taking the contractor position. Her job was analyzing drone footage, satellite images, and intercepted communications to identify potential threats and high-value targets. She worked in a small office with 2 other analysts, both men in their 40s who barely acknowledged her existence. Perfect. What nobody knew was that Sarah's real mission was far more complex and dangerous. The CIA had intercepted communications suggesting that someone inside FOB Chapman was selling intelligence to the Taliban. American operations were being compromised, soldiers were dying in carefully planned ambushes, and classified information was ending up in enemy hands. Sarah's job was to identify the traitor and eliminate them quietly. For 8 months, she had been watching, listening, and gathering evidence. She had narrowed the list of suspects down to 5 people, all of whom had access to operational intelligence and the opportunity to pass information to enemy contacts. The problem was that all 5 suspects were above suspicion. A senior NCO with 15 years of service, an intelligence officer with top-secret clearance, a communications specialist who had saved dozens of lives, a logistics coordinator who had been recommended for promotion, and a chaplain who counseled soldiers through their darkest moments. One of these trusted Americans was getting their fellow soldiers killed, and Sarah was running out of time to identify which one. The morning of October 15th started like any other. Sarah arrived at her office at 0600 hours, poured herself a cup of terrible coffee, and began reviewing overnight intelligence reports. The Taliban had been unusually quiet for the past week, which made everyone nervous. In Afghanistan, quiet usually meant that something terrible was being planned. At 0800 hours, Sarah attended the daily intelligence briefing in the command center. Major Peterson, the intelligence officer, outlined the day's patrol schedules and threat assessments. 3 squads would be conducting routine patrols in different sectors around the base. One team would be escorting a supply convoy to a nearby village. Another squad would be manning checkpoint duty on the main road. Everything seemed normal and predictable. Too predictable. Sarah noticed that Sergeant Williams, one of her suspects, was paying particularly close attention to the patrol routes. She also observed that Captain Martinez, another suspect, was taking detailed notes about the convoy schedule. Either detail could be innocent, or it could be intelligence being prepared for enemy contacts. After the briefing, Sarah returned to her office and began her real work. Using her legitimate access to intelligence systems, she started tracking communications patterns, financial records, and movement logs for all 5 suspects. The evidence was circumstantial, but building. Someone had been making unauthorized communications during specific time windows. Someone had been accessing files beyond their clearance level. Someone had been leaving the base during off-duty hours without proper documentation. At 1100 hours, her computer chimed with an urgent message. Intelligence had identified a high-value target in a compound approximately 5 miles northeast of the base. The target was Ahmad Hassan, a Taliban commander responsible for coordinating attacks against coalition forces. A quick reaction force was being assembled for immediate deployment. Sarah watched from her office window as soldiers loaded into armored vehicles. She recognized several faces, young men and women she had observed for months without ever speaking to them. They were heading into danger based on intelligence that might have been compromised by the very person she was hunting. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The American woman knows too much. Today she joins her friends. Sarah's blood went cold. Her cover had been blown. She had perhaps minutes before enemy forces reached the base. 8 months of careful invisibility had been shattered by a message that could only have come from someone inside FOB Chapman. The traitor knew who she really was and had marked her for elimination. Moving with practiced calm, Sarah began implementing emergency protocols. She wiped her computer hard drive, destroyed sensitive documents, and prepared her gear for immediate extraction. But, as she was gathering her equipment, explosions began echoing across the base. The attack was starting. Sarah looked out her window and saw rocket-propelled grenades slamming into buildings across the compound. Small arms fire erupted from multiple directions as insurgents who had somehow gotten close to the perimeter opened fire on anything that moved. The quick reaction force that had departed earlier was driving straight into an ambush, and the base was under coordinated assault from multiple angles. This wasn't a random attack. Someone had provided detailed intelligence about base defenses, patrol schedules, and the exact timing of the quick reaction force departure. The traitor hadn't just compromised Sarah's cover. They had orchestrated a massive assault designed to kill as many Americans as possible. Sarah grabbed her weapons and moved toward the command center, where she could help coordinate the defense. But, as she stepped out of her office, a sniper's bullet shattered the window behind her. She dove for cover behind a concrete barrier as automatic weapons fire erupted from a building that was supposed to be empty. The enemy wasn't just attacking the base. They were specifically hunting for her. More bullets struck the concrete around her position. Sarah could hear American voices shouting orders, calling for medical assistance, and coordinating counterattacks. But she was pinned down in an exposed position with limited ammunition and no communication with friendly forces. The invisible woman had become the most visible target on the battlefield. She tried to move to better cover, but sniper fire forced her back. A rocket-propelled grenade exploded 20 meters away, sending shrapnel flying in every direction. Sarah felt sharp pain in her left shoulder as metal fragments tore through her clothing and into her flesh. Blood began soaking through her uniform, but she couldn't stop to assess the damage. Another grenade exploded closer, and Sarah felt the world spinning around her. Something had struck her left leg, and the pain was overwhelming. She looked down to see blood pumping from a wound just above her knee. Her vision was starting to blur, and her hands were shaking from shock and blood loss. But the worst realization was that she could hear footsteps approaching her position. The enemy fighters weren't content to kill her from a distance. They wanted to confirm that the American woman was dead. Sarah tried to reach for her sidearm, but her left arm wasn't responding properly. She could barely maintain consciousness as blood continued flowing from her wounds. 8 years of training, 6 years of successful operations, and 8 months of careful investigation were about to end with her death behind a concrete barrier in Afghanistan. The footsteps were getting closer. In the distance, she could hear someone shouting, "Medic. We need a medic." But help seemed impossibly far away, and Sarah wasn't sure she could survive long enough for rescue to arrive. Her breathing was becoming shallow, her vision was darkening at the edges, and she could feel her strength draining away with every heartbeat. Then, she heard a voice much closer, speaking in accented English. "Find the woman. Make sure she is dead." Sarah forced herself to remain motionless as enemy fighters moved around her position. If they discovered she was still alive, they would finish what the grenades had started. Her only chance was to play dead and hope that American forces would reach her before she actually died from blood loss. But, as she lay there trying to control her breathing, Sarah heard something that made her heart stop. One of the enemy fighters was speaking on a radio in perfect American English, providing detailed updates about the attack's progress and specifically mentioning her location. The traitor wasn't just inside FOB Chapman. He was personally leading the assault, and he was walking directly toward her hiding place. Jake Rodriguez had seen enough war to know when something didn't smell right. 28 years old, with 6 years as a Navy SEAL and 3 deployments under his belt, he had developed an instinct for danger that had kept him alive through countless firefights. That instinct was screaming at him now as he watched the attack on FOB Chapman unfold from his position on the base perimeter. Jake wasn't supposed to be at Chapman. His SEAL team had been conducting operations out of Bagram Airfield, hunting high-value targets across eastern Afghanistan. But yesterday, their intelligence officer had received a priority message requesting immediate medical support for a sensitive operation at FOB Chapman. Jake, who had completed advanced trauma medical training, had been selected to provide that support. The timing couldn't have been worse. His team was scheduled to raid a Taliban compound the following morning, and losing their medic meant postponing an operation they had been planning for weeks. But orders were orders, and Jake had caught the first available helicopter to Chapman, arriving just 12 hours before all hell broke loose. Now, as he watched the coordinated assault develop, Jake realized this wasn't a coincidence. Someone had wanted him at Chapman specifically for this attack. The question was whether that someone was trying to protect him or kill him. The attack had started with remarkable precision. Rocket-propelled grenades had struck the communication center first, cutting off external communications and preventing calls for reinforcement. The motor pool had been hit next, disabling most of the base's vehicles and trapping personnel inside the compound. Then, snipers had taken positions in buildings that intelligence reports claimed were empty, creating deadly crossfire zones that prevented effective movement. This level of coordination required detailed knowledge of base defenses, personnel schedules, and operational procedures. Jake had participated in dozens of raids during his SEAL career, and even his team couldn't have planned a more effective assault without inside information. Someone at FOB Chapman was helping the enemy. Jake had been in the medical facility when the attack started, reviewing supplies and equipment with the base medics. The first explosion had thrown him to the ground, and training had taken over immediately. He had grabbed his medical bag, weapon, and body armor, then moved toward the sound of gunfire to provide assistance wherever needed. But as he moved across the compound, Jake noticed something troubling. The enemy seemed to know exactly where American personnel would take cover, which routes they would use to move between buildings, and where the command structure would attempt to establish defensive positions. Every American response was being anticipated and countered with deadly efficiency. Jake's SEAL training had taught him to think like both predator and prey, to anticipate enemy actions while preventing enemies from anticipating his own movements. Watching the battle develop, he could see that the attackers were operating with intelligence that could only have come from someone who understood American military tactics intimately. The radio traffic he was monitoring confirmed his suspicions. American units were reporting that enemy forces seemed to know their positions before they moved, that planned counterattacks were being met with prepared defenses, and that classified frequencies were somehow being monitored. The enemy wasn't just attacking FOB Chapman. They were demonstrating complete knowledge of how the Americans would respond. Jake made his way toward the command center, where he expected to find the heaviest fighting and the greatest need for medical assistance. But as he approached the intelligence building, he saw something that stopped him cold. A figure in American uniform was speaking into a radio while pointing toward specific buildings where U.S. personnel were taking cover. The traitor was coordinating the attack in real time. Jake couldn't get close enough to identify the person, but he could see that the individual was providing detailed updates about American positions and movements. Every piece of information was being relayed to enemy fighters, who adjusted their attacks accordingly. American soldiers were dying because someone they trusted was betraying their positions to the enemy. Rage filled Jake's chest, but his training kept him focused. Identifying the traitor was secondary to saving lives and defending the base. He could hear wounded personnel calling for medical assistance from multiple locations, and his duty was clear. The betrayal would have to wait. People were bleeding to death while he watched. Jake moved toward the sound of the nearest casualty call, using whatever cover was available to avoid sniper fire. The enemy had established overlapping fields of fire that made movement extremely dangerous, but his SEAL training had prepared him for exactly this type of environment. He moved in short rushes, using smoke and debris for concealment, never staying in one position long enough for snipers to acquire a target. The first casualty he reached was a young private who who had taken shrapnel in his chest. Jake quickly assessed the wounds, applied pressure bandages, and administered emergency medication. The soldier would survive if he could reach proper medical facilities, but moving him under fire would be extremely dangerous. "Doc, there's someone else who needs help," the private whispered through gritted teeth. Behind the intel building, civilian contractor got hit bad when this whole thing started. Jake looked toward the intelligence building and saw the concrete barriers where someone might have taken cover. The area was under constant fire from multiple angles, making any rescue attempt potentially suicidal. But if someone was wounded and trapped there, they would die without immediate medical assistance. "Can you make it to the medical facility on your own?" Jake asked the private. "Yeah, document. Go help whoever's back there. They've been quiet for a while. Might be too late already." Jake patted the soldier's shoulder and began moving toward the intelligence building. The route required crossing two open areas where snipers had clear lines of sight, but he had no choice. Someone was wounded and depending on him for survival. He made it across the first open area by timing his movement with an explosion that created temporary smoke cover. The second crossing was more difficult, requiring him to low-crawl 30 meters while bullets struck the ground around him. But his SEAL training had prepared him for movement under fire, and he reached the concrete barriers without taking a hit. Behind the barriers, Jake found her. The woman was lying motionless, blood pooled beneath her body, her breathing shallow and irregular. She appeared to be a civilian contractor based on her clothing, probably one of the intelligence analysts who worked in the nearby building. Jake could see at least two serious wounds, one in her left shoulder and another in her left leg. Both were bleeding heavily, and she was showing signs of severe shock. But something about her position didn't make sense. Despite being wounded and unconscious, the woman had instinctively positioned herself to maintain visual contact with multiple approach routes. Her right hand was near her sidearm, and her body was angled to provide maximum cover while preserving freedom of movement. These weren't the actions of a civilian contractor. They were the responses of someone with advanced tactical training. Jake began his medical assessment, checking for pulse, breathing, and additional injuries. As his hands moved across her body, he noticed other details that didn't fit her cover story. Her muscle tone was consistent with intensive physical conditioning. Her hands showed calluses typical of weapons training. Most importantly, she had instinctively positioned her injured leg to maintain weight-bearing capability, suggesting training in combat movement techniques. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Jake whispered as he began treating her wounds. "I'm a Navy medic. You're going to be okay." Her eyes opened briefly, and Jake saw something that confirmed his suspicions. Despite her injuries and blood loss, her gaze was immediately alert and assessing. She scanned the surrounding area for threats before focusing on his face. Her eyes took in his uniform, equipment, and tactical positioning in a way that suggested professional training. This wasn't a civilian contractor. This was an operator. "What's your background?" Jake asked quietly as he applied pressure bandages to her wounds. For a moment, their eyes met, and Jake saw a flash of calculation behind the pain. She was deciding how much to reveal, weighing operational security against immediate survival needs. It was a look Jake had seen in the eyes of special operations personnel who lived and died by their ability to maintain cover identities. "Intelligence analyst," she whispered, but her voice carried undertones that suggested the answer was more complex than it appeared. Jake continued his medical treatment while processing what he was seeing. The woman's injuries were serious, but not immediately life-threatening if treated properly. The shoulder wound appeared to be from shrapnel, while the leg wound looked like a bullet graze that had caused significant bleeding but missed major arteries. With proper medical care, she would make a full recovery. But as he worked, Jake became aware of voices approaching their position. Enemy fighters were moving systematically through the area, checking for wounded American personnel. He could hear them speaking in a mixture of Arabic and accented English, coordinating their search pattern to ensure no one was missed. "We need to move," Jake whispered urgently. "Can you walk?" The woman tested her injured leg carefully, wincing with pain, but maintaining control. "Maybe." "How far?" "Medical facility is about 200 meters. We'll need to move under fire." She nodded, and Jake saw something in her expression that confirmed his growing suspicions. Despite her injuries, despite being trapped in an active firefight, she was already calculating movement routes, timing opportunities, and assessing tactical options. Her mind was working like a professional operator, not a civilian contractor. Jake helped her to a sitting position, noting how she automatically checked her weapon and equipment. Her movements were economical and purposeful, betraying training that went far beyond basic civilian contractor preparation. Someone had taught her to function effectively under extreme stress, to make tactical decisions quickly, and to prioritize mission success over personal comfort. "What's your real story?" Jake asked directly. "Because you're not just an intelligence analyst." Before she could answer, they heard footsteps approaching their position. Enemy fighters were less than 50 meters away, and their voices were getting louder. Jake could distinguish at least 3 different speakers, all of them discussing the need to find and eliminate any remaining American personnel. But what made Jake's blood run cold was hearing a 4th voice responding in perfect American English. Someone in the group was a native English speaker, someone who understood American military procedures and terminology intimately. The traitor was personally leading the search for survivors. Jake looked at the wounded woman and saw recognition in her eyes. She had heard the same voice, and her expression suggested she might know who it belonged to. Her fingers tightened on her weapon, and Jake could see her preparing for a fight despite her injuries. "You know who that is?" Jake whispered. She nodded grimly. "That's why they wanted me dead. I've been hunting him for 8 months. Suddenly, everything made sense. The precision of the attack, the timing of Jake's reassignment to Chapman, and the systematic search for this particular woman all pointed to the same conclusion. She wasn't just an intelligence analyst. She was some kind of investigator or operator who had been hunting the traitor. Her presence at FOB Chapman wasn't coincidental. She had been sent here specifically to identify and eliminate whoever was selling intelligence to the enemy. And now the traitor was coming to finish the job personally. Jake made a quick tactical assessment. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in a position with limited cover and no easy escape routes. The woman was wounded and couldn't move at full speed. Enemy forces controlled most of the surrounding area, making extraction extremely difficult. But Jake was a Navy SEAL, trained for exactly this type of impossible situation. His job was to complete the mission regardless of odds, and right now his mission was keeping this woman alive long enough to expose the traitor who was getting American soldiers killed. "Can you shoot?" Jake asked quietly. She checked her weapon with practiced efficiency. "Yes." "Good. Because we're about to find out exactly who's been selling us out." The footsteps were getting closer, and Jake could hear the American voice providing detailed instructions about searching the area. Whoever the traitor was, he knew enough about the woman's position to guide enemy fighters directly to their hiding place. Jake positioned himself to provide covering fire while maintaining a clear view of approaching threats. The woman, despite her injuries, moved into a supporting position that would allow her to engage targets from a different angle. Her movements were professional and coordinated, confirming that she had received advanced combat training. As enemy fighters appeared around the concrete barrier, Jake got his first clear look at the traitor who had been coordinating the assault. What he saw made him understand why the investigation had taken 8 months, and why so many Americans had died. The traitor wasn't some disgruntled soldier or compromised contractor. He was someone everyone trusted, someone with access to the highest levels of classified information, someone whose betrayal represented the worst possible violation of military brotherhood. And now he was standing 10 meters away with a weapon pointed directly at the wounded woman. "Hello, Sarah," the traitor said in a voice that was calm and confident. "I told you that curiosity would get you killed eventually." The woman Jake now knew was named Sarah raised her weapon despite her injuries. Her voice was steady as she responded, "Hello, Tom. I've been looking for you." Jake realized he was witnessing a confrontation 8 months in the making, between a hunter and her prey, between loyalty and betrayal, between 2 professionals who understood that only one of them would survive the next few minutes. The battle for FOB Chapman was still raging around them, but the most important fight was about to happen behind a concrete barrier where a wounded operative and a Navy SEAL faced the traitor who had orchestrated the deaths of dozens of American soldiers. Tom Patterson had been the perfect soldier for 15 years. Staff Sergeant Patterson, decorated veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan, recipient of the Bronze Star, mentor to dozens of young soldiers, and the man everyone trusted with their lives. Jake had heard his name mentioned with respect throughout the base during his brief time at FOB Chapman. Patterson was the senior NCO everyone looked up to, the steady presence who kept things running smoothly, the professional soldier who embodied everything the Army valued. He was also the traitor who had orchestrated the deaths of 43 American soldiers over the past 18 months. Standing behind the concrete barrier with his weapon trained on Sarah, Patterson looked exactly like what he had always been, a competent, reliable soldier doing his job. There was no dramatic revelation in his appearance, no sudden transformation into a villain. He was simply the same man he had always been, except now Jake and Sarah could see the truth behind the facade. "You should have taken the hint 8 months ago, Sarah," Patterson said calmly. "When your handler briefed you about this assignment, he should have mentioned that some investigations are designed to fail." Sarah kept her weapon steady despite the pain from her wounds. "My handler didn't send me here, Tom. The agency did. And they're going to be very interested to learn how you knew about my assignment." Patterson smiled, and Jake saw something cold and calculating in the expression. "The agency has been compromised for longer than you realize. Your entire operation was known from the beginning. We've been watching you watch us, documenting your methods, and learning how the CIA conducts internal investigations." The implications of Patterson's words hit Jake like a physical blow. If the traitor had known about Sarah's investigation from the beginning, then her 8 months of careful work had been nothing more than an elaborate charade. Every suspect she had identified, every piece of evidence she had gathered, and every conclusion she had reached had been carefully orchestrated by someone with access to the highest levels of American intelligence. "Who's we, Tom?" Sarah asked. "Because you're not smart enough to run an operation this sophisticated by yourself." Patterson's smile widened. "You're right. I'm just a soldier following orders, same as always. But my orders don't come from the Pentagon anymore." Jake listened to the conversation while maintaining tactical awareness of their situation. Enemy fighters were positioned around their location, but they seemed content to let Patterson handle the situation personally. Through the gaps in the concrete barrier, Jake could see at least 6 insurgents maintaining a perimeter, all of them armed with automatic weapons and grenades. Even if he and Sarah could neutralize Patterson, they would still face overwhelming odds. But something about the tactical situation didn't make complete sense. The enemy fighters were maintaining their distance, almost as if they were afraid of getting too close. Patterson was conducting the conversation in English, which none of the insurgents appeared to understand. Most importantly, Patterson's weapon was trained on Sarah, but he hadn't fired yet despite having a clear shot. Patterson wanted something more than Sarah's death. He needed information. "The interesting thing about deep cover operatives," Patterson continued, "is that they accumulate so much classified information over the course of their careers. 6 years of operations across multiple theaters, contact with assets in dozens of countries, knowledge of ongoing operations, and planned missions. You're a walking intelligence goldmine, Sarah." Sarah's expression remained calm, but Jake could see her calculating options. Her injuries were limiting her mobility, but her mind was clearly working through possibilities. "If you wanted intelligence, you could have taken me alive months ago. Why the elaborate charade?" "Because we needed to understand the CIA's investigative methods. How do they identify traitors? What techniques do they use? How much do they know about our operations? Your investigation provided answers to questions we couldn't ask directly." Jake began to understand the scope of what they were facing. Patterson wasn't just a traitor selling tactical intelligence to local insurgents. He was part of a larger operation designed to compromise American intelligence capabilities at the highest levels. Sarah's mission hadn't been to catch one bad soldier. It had been to expose an entire network of foreign operatives working inside the U.S. military and intelligence community. "Who are you really working for, Tom?" Sarah pressed. "Russia? China? Iran?" Patterson shook his head. "Does it matter? The important thing is that America's time as the world's dominant power is ending. Some of us prefer to be on the winning side when that happens. The casual way Patterson discussed betraying his country made Jake's stomach turn. This wasn't a soldier who had been blackmailed or coerced into collaboration. This was someone who had willingly chosen to sell out his fellow Americans for personal gain. Every soldier who had died in Patterson's carefully planned ambushes had been sacrificed to advance the agenda of America's enemies. Jake noticed that Sarah was slowly adjusting her position, moving despite her injuries to improve her firing angle. Patterson seemed focused on the conversation and wasn't paying attention to her subtle movements. If she could create a distraction, Jake might be able to neutralize Patterson before the surrounding insurgents could react. But Patterson was more observant than Jake had anticipated. "Stay very still, Sarah. I have a dozen fighters surrounding this position, and they have orders to kill anyone who moves aggressively. Right now, you and your SEAL friend are alive because I want you alive. That can change very quickly." Jake realized that Patterson knew his identity and background. The traitor had access to personnel files and operational schedules, which explained how Jake had been specifically requested at FOB Chapman. His presence wasn't coincidental. It was part of a larger plan that Patterson had been orchestrating. "Why did you want me here?" Jake asked directly. Patterson turned his attention to Jake for the first time. "SEALs have access to information that regular soldiers don't. Mission plans, target lists, operational schedules. You've participated in raids that captured high-value targets, and you know how those operations were planned and executed. That information is valuable to the right buyers." Jake understood that he was looking at someone who had spent years building a network of contacts and buyers for American intelligence. Patterson wasn't just a soldier who had been turned by enemy forces. He was essentially running a business that traded American lives for foreign money. "How many soldiers have died because of information you sold?" Jake asked. "I don't keep count," Patterson replied. "War has casualties. The only difference is that some of us profit from those casualties instead of just becoming them." The callousness in Patterson's voice made Jake realize that they weren't dealing with a misguided soldier or someone who had been pressured into betrayal. Patterson was a sociopath who viewed his fellow Americans as commodities to be traded for personal advantage. He felt no guilt about the deaths he had caused and no loyalty to the soldiers who trusted him with their lives. Sarah had been quietly testing the mobility in her injured leg, and Jake could see her preparing for action despite her wounds. But any movement would have to be perfectly coordinated to succeed against the overwhelming odds they faced. "Tom, you've been sloppy," Sarah said suddenly. "The financial transfers, the communication patterns, the timing of compromised operations. I have enough evidence to connect you to at least 26 different incidents. Your network is blown." Patterson laughed. "My network extends far beyond anything you discovered. You've been chasing shadows while the real operation continued around you. Every piece of evidence you gathered was carefully planted to lead you toward conclusions we wanted you to reach." Jake realized that Sarah was trying to provoke Patterson into revealing more information about his network and contacts. If they survived this encounter, any intelligence about the scope of the betrayal would be crucial for preventing future attacks and identifying other compromised personnel. "The attack on FOB Chapman was always the endgame," Patterson continued. "We needed to eliminate you while making it look like a random Taliban assault. Your death here will close the investigation, and my handlers will extract me to continue operations elsewhere." Sarah's expression didn't change, but Jake could see her processing this information. Patterson's extraction plan meant that he had a predetermined escape route from the base, probably involving transportation across the Pakistan border. But it also meant that his foreign handlers considered him valuable enough to risk an extraction operation. "Where's the extraction point, Tom?" Sarah asked. "You're very persistent, even when you're bleeding to death. That's an admirable quality in an operative. Unfortunately, it's also the quality that got you into this situation." Patterson gestured to one of the insurgents surrounding their position, and the man approached carrying what appeared to be zip ties and a small device that looked like an interrogation tool. Jake realized that